Hi team. So over the last couple of days, we've been seeing a lot of play in the media about saturated fat as a result of this presidential advisory statement from the American Heart Association around about saturated fats and how it's sort of posited in the way that it's irrefutable that saturated fats are associated with negative outcomes for cardiovascular disease. And this brings to mind, I think, a very important topic from my point of view, and that's the topic of using proxy measures. So we won't be going into the study in depth at this point, but one thing that's really important to remember when we look at things like this is a lot of what we're seeing is modeling. And with respect to this, a lot of the modeling that we're seeing is based on LDL or low density lipoprotein levels in the blood and how the diet or how certain things affect that. So if we're eating a diet that causes increases in LDL cholesterol, or we're eating a particular food type, let's say saturated fats, that may increase LDL cholesterol in the blood, then that is equated with cardiovascular disease and deaths resulting from cardiovascular disease. Now, the problem is that that's not always completely accurate. When we simply take what I call a proxy measure from the blood, we call it a proxy measure because it's something that we can measure from the body that is associated or related to an outcome like cardiovascular disease. It doesn't always mean that that is what occurs. Now, it's particularly true when people are following particular diets, for example. If someone is eating a large amount of saturated fat and they're also eating a lot of sugar and a lot of high carbohydrate, highly processed foods, maybe they're also concurrently eating a lot of maybe pro-inflammatory omega-6 fats or trans fats, then it's likely that they're getting the worst of all worlds. And it's very likely that that will predispose to cardiovascular disease. However, when people are following, for example, a lower carb diet, we generally don't see those types of results. So whenever we're looking at a proxy measure like LDL, we also need to look at other things that are occurring. And I think it's fair to say that many researchers, clinicians like myself, would now say that LDL, while important, is not the whole story. There are other things that we would look at that would probably give us a greater indication as to the metabolic health of someone and whether they're going to be more likely to be predisposed to some of these disorders. Things like HbA1c levels, which is that average of blood glucose over time, HDL, triglycerides in particular, that's one of the key things that we would look at first. And often when we see people in, for example, low carbohydrate trials or even trials where people are eating a just eat real food type diet, let's call it paleo prime or whatever silly names we want to wrap around it, they will often have improvements in those things, even where there's a worsening of LDL. We also obviously need to look at lipid subfractions, and I think as many of you know, LDL is not just LDL. There are different types of LDL. There's large particle LDL and small particle LDL, and there's different types of LDL, some of which we would consider to be much more positive health-wise than others. And so it's not always the simple story of taking a blood measure which is correlated with an outcome and then expecting for that to model into an easy answer, because it often doesn't. My colleagues and I think that there may be some things that haven't been considered correctly, and this is particularly true when we talk about things like coconut oil, maybe some of the more esoteric fats. And so I'd highly suggest that you check out our HBN article on coconut oil. It is a couple of years old now, so we do need to do an update, but that summarizes the available evidence for coconut oil. Now, what that's done is not looking at proxy measures and modeling. We've looked at population data, number one, to see if populations who have eaten a lot of coconut oil have suffered negative outcomes, and typically they haven't, and comparing very similar types of populations where they perhaps eat coconut oil or more saturated fat versus a very similar population who is eating more other vegetable oils, the high omega-6 polyunsaturated fat vegetable oils, and looking at the differences there. And we typically don't see a negative effect there. I would also, and there's also in there some randomized controlled trial data as well, where we're looking directly at substitution data between coconut oil and other types of vegetable oils and seeing really no worsening in outcomes from coconut oil. I'd also highly suggest that you check out our real food guidelines that the team up at AUT University put together a few years ago. Again, this is probably something that needs to be updated as a living document, but a lot of the substitution data that you're seeing being used to support the vilification of saturated fat is really open to interpretation. And I think you'll enjoy reading those real food guidelines and our submission to the Ministry of Health here in New Zealand, because we took a different look at that substitution data and how it could be interpreted, and how, in our opinion, it really doesn't show this massive negative effect from saturated fat. A key point to take away from that is that when saturated fat was substituted for polyunsaturated fats in many of these studies, there were positive outcomes. So we would accept that. However, in many of these studies as well, when saturated fats were substituted with monounsaturated fats, which are typically considered heart healthy, there really wasn't much of an effect. And when saturated fats were substituted for carbohydrate, in other words, you take saturated fat out of the diet and you put carbohydrate in to make up the calories, there's really no benefit to doing that. And so if saturated fat were the problem, we would expect for any change where you reduce that to be a good thing. And that's certainly not something we see. So what we concluded in that document is that, sure, polyunsaturated fats are important. It's likely that it's because those include those essential fats that we need for survival and health anyway. And so that casts a little bit of doubt on some of the results that you're seeing now. So I'll put those links in the comments here or in the text. So click on those, check it out. If you've got any questions, just drop me a line.